A hand slammed against my chest and pushed me back before I even reached the gate. I stumbled, caught my balance, and looked up at the creature standing over me. He was easily 7 feet tall, with gray-plated skin and eyes that glowed faint amber in the morning light. His name tag read Draxus Vel, and every line on his face said he had been waiting all morning for someone like me to walk through that gate. "Humans don't get to walk in like everyone else," he said, his voice low and amused. "Not until you prove you're not a mistake." Behind him, a crowd of cadets from a dozen different worlds had already stopped to watch. Some had scales, some had 4 arms. One had no visible eyes at all, but somehow still seemed to be staring at me. None of them said a word. None of them moved to help. This was clearly not the first time Draxus had done something like this, and it was clearly not going to be the last. My name is Mia Bennett. 6 months ago, I was standing in a recruitment office on Earth, signing papers that would make me the first human cadet ever accepted into the Xenarch Military Academy. I had trained for this moment my whole life. I did not train to be shoved backward by a bully before I even made it through the front gate. "I'm not here to prove anything to you," I said, keeping my voice steady. Draxus laughed, and a few cadets behind him laughed with him, though I noticed most of them laughed a half-second late, like they were following his lead rather than actually finding it funny. "Everyone proves something to me," he said. "That's how it works here. New cadets earn their place, especially the small, breakable ones." He stepped closer, and I had to fight the urge to step back. I had read about his species before I left Earth. Strong, proud, built for endurance and force. On paper, if this turned into any kind of physical contest, I would lose badly. I was not strong enough, not fast enough, not big enough. I knew that. He knew that too, and he was counting on it. There a problem here? The crowd went still. I hadn't even seen her walk up. She was standing just behind Draxus, arms crossed, wearing the deep green uniform of an academy instructor. She was not particularly tall for her species, and she didn't carry herself like she needed to be. There was something quiet and sharp about the way she looked at the scene in front of her, like she was already 3 steps ahead of everyone else present. Draxus straightened up immediately, some of his confidence draining out of his shoulders. "Instructor Kess, just welcoming the new cadet." "Is that what you call it?" she said. It wasn't a question. She stepped around him, without waiting for an answer, and walked straight up to me. I braced myself for a lecture. "New cadets get tested. Learn to handle it. Don't cause a scene on your first day." I had heard variations of that speech from recruiters back home, more than once. Instead, Instructor Kess did something that made the entire courtyard go silent. She looked me directly in the eyes, straightened her posture, and said, "Cadet Bennett, I apologize. This should not have happened, and it will not happen again." For a moment, I genuinely thought I had misheard her. Draxus clearly thought the same thing, because his mouth opened and then closed again without any sound coming out. Somewhere behind him, one of the 4 armed cadets muttered something in a language I didn't understand, but the tone was unmistakable disbelief. "I'm sorry," I said carefully. "You're apologizing to me?" "I am." "Instructor Kess," Draxus said, finding his voice again, "with respect, she is a first-year cadet. I was only testing her the way every cadet gets tested." "You were not testing her the way every cadet gets tested," Instructor Kess said, still not looking away from me. "You were testing her the way you assumed a human could be tested. Those are very different things, and by the end of today, you will understand why." I had no idea what she meant by that. Neither, judging by his expression, did Draxus. "Cadet Bennett," she continued, "walk with me." I glanced at Draxus one last time. He was staring at me now with a completely different expression than the one he'd worn moments earlier. Confusion had replaced amusement. Whatever certainty he'd walked up to that gate with, it was gone now, and I could tell he did not like the feeling of not knowing something. I followed Instructor Kess through the gate, leaving the crowd and their whispers behind us. My legs were still a little unsteady, more from confusion than fear. I had prepared myself for judgment, for mockery, for having to work twice as hard to be taken seriously. I had not prepared myself for an instructor apologizing to me within the first 5 minutes of arriving. We walked in silence for a while, past training yards where cadets from a dozen species were running drills, sparring, and moving through obstacle courses built for bodies far stronger than mine. I tried to keep my expression neutral, but my mind was racing. Something about this situation did not add up, and I was determined to figure out what it was. "You're wondering why I apologized," Instructor Kess said finally, without turning to look at me. The thought crossed my mind, yes. Most instructors would not have intervened at all, she said. Cadets test each other constantly here. It is considered part of the culture. Strength recognizing strength, or exposing weakness, before it becomes a liability in the field. Draxus was simply doing what generations of cadets before him have done to newcomers. Then why did you stop him? She finally turned to look at me, and there was something in her expression I couldn't quite place. Not pity, not curiosity exactly, something closer to careful respect, the kind you give something you don't yet fully understand, but have learned not to underestimate. "Because I received your file 3 days ago," she said. "And after reading it, I made the personal decision that no cadet under my supervision would be allowed to test you the way Draxus intended. Not because you need protection, Cadet Bennett, because he does." I stopped walking. "I'm sorry, what?" "You heard me correctly." "I don't understand." Instructor Kess studied me for a long moment, as if deciding how much to say. Around us, the training yard noise continued, distant shouts and the clash of practice weapons, but it felt like background static compared to the weight of what she was about to tell me. "Cadet Bennett," she said slowly, "how much do you know about what happened at the Kestrel line 8 months ago?" I blinked. "The trade dispute. I read a summary before I left Earth. Some kind of standoff between a coalition fleet and pirate raiders near the outer settlements." "That is the summary given to the general public," she said. "It is not entirely accurate." "Then what actually happened?" She glanced around the courtyard, at the cadets still watching us from a distance, and lowered her voice slightly. "What actually happened," she said, "is the reason half of this academy's teaching staff spent the last 2 months rewriting our combat psychology curriculum. What actually happened is the reason your file crossed my desk with a priority flag I have only seen twice in my entire career. And what actually happened, Cadet Bennett, is something Draxus Vel has absolutely no idea about, which is precisely why he is currently standing at that gate, wondering what he just walked into." My heart was beating faster now, though I couldn't have said exactly why. "Instructor, I don't know what you're talking about." "I wasn't at Kestrel." "No," she agreed, "you weren't, but someone very close to you was." She let that sentence hang in the air between us, and for the first time since I had arrived at the academy, I felt like the ground beneath my feet was less solid than I had believed. "Walk with me to my office," Instructor Kess said. "There is a great deal you need to know before this day is finished, and I suspect once you do, you will understand exactly why I apologize to you, and exactly why Draxus Vel is about to learn a lesson he will not enjoy." Instructor Kess's office was smaller than I expected, tucked into a quiet corridor away from the noise of the training yards. The walls were lined with old star charts and framed commendations written in languages I couldn't read. She gestured for me to sit, then took her place behind a desk covered in data tablets, and for a moment she simply looked at me, as if deciding where to begin. 8 months ago," she said finally, "a coalition patrol ship called the Marin Vale was escorting 3 civilian transports through the Kestrel line. The transports carried refugees, families relocating from a mining colony that had lost its atmospheric shielding. Nothing unusual, a routine escort mission." "And the pirates attacked," I said. "Not pirates," she corrected, "a splinter faction. Armed, organized, and far better equipped than anyone expected. They struck the convoy with 3 warships, faster and more heavily armed than the single patrol vessel protecting it. By every calculation available to Coalition Command, the Marin Vale should have retreated immediately. Its survival odds in a prolonged engagement were less than 4%. But it didn't retreat. No, Instructor Kess said, it didn't. She tapped a control on her desk, and a small holographic display flickered to life above it, showing a diagram of the battle. 3 enemy ships surrounding a single, smaller vessel and the 3 transports it was protecting. The Marin Vale's captain made a decision that, according to every combat model in Coalition records, should not have been possible, she continued. Rather than retreat and abandon the transports, the crew reconfigured their own ship's shields to redirect power away from offense entirely, and used the vessel itself as a moving barrier between the enemy warships and the civilian transports. For 6 hours, under continuous fire, I felt something tighten in my chest. 6 hours? 6 hours, she confirmed. Long enough for the transports to reach the jump point and escape. Long enough for a Coalition response fleet to arrive. The Marin Vale was, by every technical measure, destroyed beyond repair by the end of the engagement. And yet the crew kept working, kept redirecting power, kept making impossible repairs mid-battle, for 6 hours, because 6 hours was exactly how long the civilians needed. That's incredible, I said quietly, but I still don't understand what this has to do with me. Instructor Kess looked at me directly. The captain of the Marin Vale was human, so was most of the crew, and the tactical officer who first proposed using the ship as a shield, who calculated exactly how long the vessel could hold together under sustained fire, who refused 3 separate orders to abandon position and retreat, was a young lieutenant named Daniel Bennett. The room went very quiet. "My father," I said slowly. "Your father," she agreed. I sat back in my chair, my mind struggling to fit these pieces together. My father had told me almost nothing about that mission. He'd come home quieter than usual, spent more time staring out windows, but he never described what had happened out there. I had assumed it was simply a difficult deployment, the kind soldiers don't like discussing. I had never imagined it was this. "He never told me any of this," I said. "Most survivors of that engagement don't talk about it," Instructor Kess said, partly because Coalition Command classified most of the details, partly, I suspect, because it is not an easy thing to describe, choosing to stand and hold rather than run, when every rational calculation says running is the only sensible option. "Why classify it?" "Because it terrified people," she said simply. "Not the enemy. Us. The Coalition. For decades, combat doctrine across 100 different species has operated on a simple principle. When the odds are bad enough, you retreat, and no one blames you for it. It is not cowardice, it is simply logic. Humans, it turns out, do not always follow that principle, and when they don't, they occasionally succeed at things that should be mathematically impossible. I thought about my father sitting quietly at the dinner table, refusing to talk about his deployments, and something in my chest ached with a new kind of understanding. After the Kestrel Line incident, Instructor Kess continued, Coalition analysts spent months studying human combat history. Not just military engagements, rescue operations, survival situations, cases where humans, individually and collectively, chose to continue past the point where every other species in Coalition records would have stopped. The conclusion those analysts reached was uncomfortable for a great many people in positions of authority. What conclusion? That human tolerance for unfavorable odds is significantly higher than any other known species, and that this trait, when properly applied, produces outcomes that conventional strategy cannot predict or counter. In simple terms, Cadet Bennett, humans do not reliably know when they are supposed to quit, and that unpredictability has become something Coalition military planners now take very seriously. I let that settle for a moment. So when my application came in, your file was flagged the moment the system recognized your surname alongside your service record request, she said, not because you are your father's daughter and not because anyone assumes you inherited his exact abilities, but because your presence here, As the first human cadet in Academy history, arriving less than a year after Kestrel Line became public knowledge among senior officers, was never going to be treated as ordinary. Every instructor on this campus received a briefing on human combat psychology 2 months ago. Draxus Vel, being a first-year cadet himself, did not. So he genuinely had no idea. None, she confirmed. He saw a smaller, physically weaker cadet arrive at the gate, and he did what generations of cadets before him have done to newcomers who look easy to intimidate. He had no way of knowing that the species he was testing had just spent the last several months forcing this academy's entire senior staff to rewrite how we think about combat resolve. I sat with that for a long moment, feeling something shift inside me. I had come to this academy expecting to prove myself through hard work, through discipline, through simply outlasting doubt one day at a time. I had not expected to discover that the ground had already shifted beneath everyone's expectations before I even arrived. What happens now? I asked. Instructor Kess leaned back slightly. Now, you have a choice. Draxus Vel will not simply accept an apology and move on. His pride will demand some kind of resolution, some way to prove that his initial assessment of you was not entirely wrong. Academy custom allows for this. A formal challenge, sparring, judged by observers, resolved without serious harm to either party. You're saying he's going to challenge me. I am saying he almost certainly will, likely before the end of the day, she said. And I want you to understand something before that happens. You are not obligated to accept. No instructor will think less of you for declining a challenge from a cadet 3 times your physical strength. There is no shame in choosing not to fight a battle you did not start. I thought about my father, sitting quietly in a shattered ship for 6 hours, refusing 3 direct orders to retreat, because 6 hours was exactly what those transports needed. I thought about Draxus Vel's face at the gate, so certain, so unbothered by the idea that a human girl might be more than what he assumed. I'll accept, I said. Instructor Kess studied me for a long moment, and something that might have been the beginning of a smile crossed her face before disappearing again into her usual composed expression. I thought you might say that, she said. Then let us make sure you understand exactly what you are walking into, Cadet Bennett, because Draxus Vel's species does not fight the way yours does, and if you intend to win this, you will need to think, not simply endure. Instructor Kess spent the next hour walking me through everything she knew about Draxus Vel's species, and by the end of it, my head was spinning with more information than I had absorbed in an entire semester of pre-departure briefings back on Earth. His people were called the Torvin, a species built for endurance under raw physical stress. Their bones were denser than steel alloy, their muscle fiber capable of generating force that would shatter a human bone on contact. In open combat, a Torvin cadet could outlift, outstrike, and outlast almost anyone in the academy without breaking a sweat. Draxus was, by every physical measure available, exactly the kind of opponent I had no business standing against. But Instructor Kess kept returning to one detail, over and over, as if she wanted to make sure it stuck in my mind before anything else did. The Torvin do not train for long engagements, she said. Their bodies are built for overwhelming force, delivered quickly. A Torvin duel typically ends within the first 2 minutes, because that is how long it takes for one side to simply be unable to continue. Their entire fighting culture is built around dominance established early and decisively. So if I can survive past 2 minutes, you enter territory their training does not prepare them for, she said. I am not telling you this because it guarantees anything. I am telling you this because it is the only real advantage you have, and you will need to use it deliberately, not by accident. We spent the rest of the afternoon in a private training room, 1 instructor and 1 cadet, working through everything I already knew from years of hand-to-hand training back home, and reshaping it around this new understanding of my opponent. She taught me how the Torvin telegraphed their strikes, small shifts in weight before a heavy blow, a slight lowering of the shoulder before a strong swing. She taught me how their pride made them predictable, how a Torvan cadet, expecting an easy victory, would often commit fully to an opening attack, assuming it would end things immediately. "They will not expect you to still be standing after the first exchange," she said. "Use that. Confusion is worth more than strength if you know how to spend it." By the time evening arrived, word of the confrontation at the gate had spread through the entire academy. I could feel it in the way cadets watched me in the hallways, some with open curiosity, some with the same dismissive amusement Draxus had shown that morning, and a few, surprisingly, with something that looked almost like quiet support. I passed a small group of first-years near the mess hall, and one of them, a lanky boy with pale blue skin and enormous dark eyes, gave me a small nod as I walked by. I didn't know his name yet, but I appreciated the gesture more than I expected to. The formal challenge came exactly as Instructor Kess predicted, delivered not by Draxus himself, but by a senior cadet acting as his second, a tall Torvan named Breck, who seemed to genuinely believe he was doing me a courtesy by explaining the rules in slow, deliberate detail, as if I might not otherwise understand them. "The match will be held in the East Yard tomorrow at midday," Breck said, "witnessed by instructors and senior cadets in accordance with Academy tradition. The match ends when one party yields, is rendered unable to continue, or when the presiding instructor calls a stop for safety reasons. There is no shame in yielding, human. Draxus does not intend permanent harm. He intends only to demonstrate what should have been obvious this morning. I understand the rules," I said. "Tell him I'll see him tomorrow." Breck studied me for a moment, something flickering behind his eyes that might have been curiosity, or perhaps the smallest seed of doubt, before he nodded once and walked away. That night, I sat alone in my quarters, staring at the small window that looked out over the training yards, now empty and quiet under the artificial twilight the Academy used to simulate a day and night cycle. I thought about my father again, about the quiet way he used to sit with his coffee in the mornings, saying nothing, carrying something I had never fully understood until today. I pulled up an old message on my personal datapad, one my father had sent me the week before I left for the academy. I had read it a dozen times already, but I read it again that night, looking for something new in his words, now that I understood what he had actually lived through. "Mia," the message read, "you are going somewhere I never got the chance to go. They will look at you and see something small. Let them. Being underestimated is not a weakness, it is room to work with. Whatever happens out there, remember that giving up is always technically an option. It is simply not one we tend to take." I read it 3 more times before finally setting the datapad down and trying to sleep. Morning came faster than I expected, and by the time I made my way to the East Yard, a crowd had already gathered far larger than the one that had watched my arrival at the gate the day before. Word travels fast in a place like the Academy, and apparently a human cadet accepting a formal challenge from a Torvan bully was considered must-see entertainment by cadets from at least a dozen different species. Instructor Kess stood near the center of the yard, along with 2 other instructors I didn't recognize, presumably there to ensure the match remained within the bounds of Academy safety rules. Draxus was already waiting, stripped down to a simple training uniform, his massive frame looking even larger under the open morning sky than it had at the gate the day before. He looked confident. He looked, if anything, faintly bored, as if this were a formality he intended to complete quickly before moving on with his day. "You came," he said, as I stepped into the marked ring at the center of the yard. "I said I would." "Foolish, but I suppose I should not be surprised," he said. "I will try not to hurt you more than necessary, human. This is simply a lesson, not a punishment." "I appreciate the consideration," I said, and something in my calm tone seemed to genuinely unsettle him, just slightly, though he covered it quickly with a small laugh. Instructor Kess stepped forward to address the gathered crowd, her voice carrying easily across the yard, despite its size. This match will proceed under standard Academy rules. It ends when one cadet yields, is rendered unable to continue, or I call a stop. Both cadets understand the terms? Understood, Draxus said, still watching me with that same faint amusement. Understood, I echoed. Then take your positions, Instructor Kess said, stepping back to the edge of the ring. I moved to my mark, feeling the weight of dozens of unfamiliar eyes on me, feeling the particular silence of a crowd that expects to see something over quickly. I thought about the 2-minute window Instructor Kess had described. I thought about my father's message, about room to work with, about giving up always technically being an option and simply not one we tend to take. Across the ring, Draxus rolled his shoulders once, settling into a low, powerful stance built for exactly the kind of overwhelming first strike his species had trained for across countless generations. Begin, Instructor Kess said. For 1 full second, neither of us moved, and in that second, the entire yard seemed to hold its breath along with me. Then Draxus lunged forward, and everything I had spent the last day preparing for was suddenly, immediately, real. Draxus moved faster than his size suggested he could, closing the distance between us in a single powerful step, his arm already swinging toward where I had been standing a moment before. I dropped low and to the side, feeling the air shift as his strike passed just above my shoulder, close enough that I felt the pressure of it against my skin. The crowd made a small collective sound, somewhere between surprise and anticipation. Draxus recovered quickly, turning to face me again, and I saw something shift in his expression. Not concern, not yet, but a small flicker of recalculation, as if his mental model of how this match was supposed to go had just needed a minor adjustment. "Quick," he said, "that will not save you twice." He came at me again, this time with a lower strike aimed at my legs, clearly intending to end things by simply removing my ability to stay on my feet. I sidestepped again, using the same shift in weight Instructor Kess had shown me the day before, the small telltale lowering of his shoulder that gave away his intention half a second before he committed to it. I did not strike back. Not yet. Instructor Kess had been clear about this part of the strategy. Any exchange of direct force with a Torvan cadet in the early stages of a match was a losing proposition for me, no matter how well I dodged. My best use of those first minutes was simply staying upright, staying unpredictable, and letting Draxus spend energy on strikes that connected with nothing but open air. He tried 3 more times in quick succession, each strike heavier and more committed than the last, each one just barely missing as I moved with everything I had learned. By the 4th attempt, I could hear his breathing changing slightly, no longer the steady, controlled rhythm of the confident opening moments, but something with a little more effort behind it. "Stand still," he said, an edge of frustration creeping into his voice now. "I don't think I will," I said. The crowd, which had been mostly silent, began to murmur, a low buzz of surprised conversation spreading through the gathered cadets. I caught a glimpse of Instructor Kess at the edge of the ring, her expression carefully neutral, though I thought I saw the faintest flicker of something like approval in her eyes. Draxus came at me again, and this time I noticed something new in his approach, a slight hesitation before committing fully, as if some part of him had started questioning whether the overwhelming first strike his species relied on was actually going to work the way it always had before. That hesitation cost him precious fractions of a second, and I used every one of them. I ducked under his swing and, for the first time, moved in close rather than away, driving my palm into the side of his knee at an angle designed not to overpower him, which I could never do, but to disrupt his balance at a joint his species' otherwise incredible density couldn't fully protect. He staggered, more from surprise than actual pain, and took 2 steps back to recover his footing. "You're supposed to be fragile," he said, and for the first time, there was something other than confidence in his voice. "I never said I was fragile," I said. "You assumed that." He came at me again, angrier now, less controlled, and I recognized the shift immediately. This was exactly what Instructor Kess had warned me about and hoped for in equal measure. A Torvan losing patience stopped fighting with the calculated precision of a species that expected quick victories and started fighting like someone trying to force an outcome that wasn't arriving on schedule. I kept moving, kept dodging, kept letting him spend himself against a target that refused to simply stand still and lose the way he expected. Minutes passed, longer than any Torvan duel was designed to last, and I could see the difference in him now. His breathing heavier, his strikes slightly less precise, his frustration bleeding into every movement. The crowd's murmur had grown louder, no longer simply surprised, but genuinely invested, watching something unfold that none of them had expected to see when they gathered that morning, expecting an easy, one-sided demonstration. I caught an opening, a strike that came in slightly too wide, slightly too committed, and I used it, driving forward and using his own forward momentum against him, redirecting, rather than opposing, exactly the way Instructor Kess had shown me the day before. Draxus stumbled forward past me, off balance for just a moment, and in that moment I moved behind him and applied pressure to a joint at the back of his knee, not with force he could have simply overpowered, but with precise leverage that made continuing to stand upright genuinely difficult. He went down to one knee, breathing hard, and for a long moment neither of us moved. The yard had gone almost completely silent. "Yield," I said quietly, not as a taunt, but simply as an offer. "This doesn't need to go further." Draxus knelt there for a long moment, his massive frame trembling slightly with exertion, clearly weighing something in his mind that had nothing to do with the physical position he found himself in. I could see the pride warring with the plain, undeniable reality of what had just happened. "How?" he said finally, not looking up. "How is this possible?" "I didn't outfight you," I said. "I just didn't stop." He was quiet for another long moment, and then, slowly, he raised one hand, palm open, the Academy's recognized gesture of yielding a formal match. "I yield," he said, his voice quieter than I had heard it before. Instructor Kess stepped forward immediately. "The match is concluded. Cadet Bennett is the winner." The silence in the yard broke into a wave of sound, cadets talking rapidly to each other, some in open disbelief, others already speculating about what this meant, what it said about the assumptions they had all walked in with that morning. I stepped back and offered Draxus a hand, which after a moment of visible hesitation, he actually took, letting me help him back to his feet. "You were not what I expected," he said quietly, once he was standing again, his voice carrying none of the mocking edge from the day before. "Most people don't expect much from us," I said. "That's kind of the point." He studied me for a long moment, and something in his expression shifted, not quite a full transformation, but the beginning of one. "I owe you an apology, Cadet Bennett, and I suspect I owe your species a broader one as well, given what I am only now beginning to understand." "An apology to me is a good start," I said, and for the first time since arriving at the Academy, I felt myself smile. News of the match spread through the Academy faster than anything I had experienced in my short time there. By the time I made it to the mess hall that evening, cadets I had never spoken to were glancing my way, some with open curiosity, a few with the same wary respect I had seen grow in Draxus's expression at the end of our match. It was a strange feeling, walking through a crowd that had watched me get shoved backward at a gate less than 2 days earlier, now watching me with an entirely different kind of attention. Instructor Kess found me near the edge of the hall, carrying a data tablet under one arm, her expression as composed as always, though something in the set of her shoulders seemed a little lighter than it had the day before. "You did well," she said, sitting across from me without waiting for an invitation. "I got lucky," I said. "He committed to strikes that missed. If even one of them had connected properly, this conversation would be very different." "Perhaps," she said. "But luck does not explain why you refuse to simply match strength with strength, when every instinct in an untrained fighter would have told you to try exactly that. Luck does not explain why you kept moving, long after most cadets your size would have already yielded from sheer exhaustion. What happened in that ring today was not luck, Cadet Bennett. It was precisely the trait I described to you yesterday, applied deliberately and with discipline. I thought about that for a moment, turning the words over in my mind. My father used to say giving up was always technically an option. He just never seemed to take it. A fitting sentiment for someone whose actions rewrote how an entire alliance of species evaluates human potential, Instructor Kess said. For what it is worth, Cadet Bennett, I believe you are going to make quite an impression on this academy over the coming years, and I do not say that lightly. Over the following weeks, things at the academy shifted in small but noticeable ways. Draxus, true to whatever internal reckoning he had gone through after our match, made a point of formally apologizing to me in front of several other cadets, an act I later learned was considered a significant gesture within his culture, one that carried real weight among his peers. He never became a close friend exactly, but the mocking edge he once carried disappeared entirely, replaced by something closer to careful curiosity, and occasionally, when other cadets tried the same tactics he once had, he was the first to quietly discourage them. I made genuine friends too, cadets who had watched the match and decided that a species capable of what they'd witnessed deserved a closer look rather than easy dismissal. The lanky blue-skinned boy who had nodded at me in the hallway turned out to be named Ellis Marrow, a bright, endlessly curious first year from a distant colony world, and he became one of the first real friends I made at the academy, always full of questions about Earth, about my father, about what exactly humans meant when they talked about not knowing when to quit. It's not really about not knowing, I told him one evening, sitting together in the quiet courtyard outside our dormitory. It's about deciding the cost of continuing is worth paying, even when the numbers say otherwise. Sometimes that's foolish. Sometimes it isn't. The trick is figuring out which is which, and honestly, we don't always get that right. But often enough, Ellis said, that it changed how an entire alliance thinks about your species. Often enough, I agreed. I thought often, in those early weeks, about my father, about the message he had sent me before I left Earth, about the quiet mornings where he sat with his coffee and said nothing about what he had lived through in that shattered ship for 6 long hours. I sent him a message one night, describing everything that had happened at the gate, the apology, the match, the strange new way cadets looked at me now. His reply came the next morning, shorter than I expected, but it stayed with me longer than almost anything else from those first weeks at the academy. Proud of you, it read, not because you won, because you understood what winning actually required. That's the part most people miss. Standing at the edge of the training yard one quiet morning, several weeks into my first term, I found myself thinking back to that first day, to Draxus's hand against my chest, to the certainty in his eyes that a small, unassuming human girl had no business walking through that gate as an equal. I thought about how quickly that certainty had unraveled, not because I had proven myself stronger than him, which I never was and never would be, but because strength had never actually been the question worth asking in the first place. The galaxy, it seemed, had spent a very long time assuming it understood exactly what it was dealing with when it came to humanity. Small, short-lived, physically unremarkable compared to half the species in the coalition. Easy to underestimate. Easy to dismiss, easy to test at a gate and expect the test to end quickly and predictably. What the galaxy was only beginning to understand, one battle and one duel at a time, was that being underestimated had never actually been a disadvantage for us. It had simply been room to work with, exactly as my father had written, and exactly as I intended to keep proving, one day at the academy at a time. I was the first human cadet to walk through those gates. I would not be the last, and if the last several weeks had taught me anything, it was that the galaxy had absolutely no idea what was coming for it next. I adjusted my uniform, took a breath of the cool morning air, and walked toward my first class of the day, ready for whatever the academy intended to throw at me next.